They first contacted me,
And now I mute, right?
given the title of opportunities and challenges. So rather than a straight how-to, I'm going to do a little bit of a flyover overview of bass as a culture species, focusing on food fish production, because I think that's what most of us in this particular workshop are interested in, although the food sport fish market is certainly substantial and a better fit for a lot of producers. Kind of the why the largemouth, the largemouth bass, compared to other species like hybrid striped bass, relatively easy to reproduce. They'll do it on their own. There's not a lot of hormonal manipulation. We do have good competing markets for both pond stocking sport fish and for food fish. Both of them bring relatively high dollar returns, with food fish markets bringing up to $6.50 a pound at times. And a little later in, we'll update some of those numbers. They are a native fish, so there's not a lot of pushback on stocking them in ponds and natural bodies of water. And they do have a wide range of growth based on water temperature. Some of the disadvantages, unlike our more widely cultured species like catfish and trout, they don't go right on artificial feeds. They have to be trained to take those feeds. So that is a step that adds complicated factor and cost to our fingerling cost with these. Compared to some of the other species, they do like high protein levels, which raises our feed cost. Because of sport fish lobbyists, there are oppositions to the fish as a food fish in some areas, although that's been changing in recent years. And matter of fact, Florida just opened up a legal food fish market in Florida just in the last few weeks. But in many ways, as culture species, there's more political problems than there are really biological problems. Although we have, with all fish, some biological problems to be dealt with. Some of the problems that we do have, we continue to have liver problems. We have very unhealthy livers. Before working with this fish, my background was in catfish. I opened up a lot of catfish, and their livers would look worse than the bass, but the bass really tends to have a lot of problems that we think are possibly associated with high carbohydrates. That's the best data we have. Sean and I are gearing up to do one to look at aflatoxins to see if it may be a high susceptibility to mold toxins in there that would create a lot of issues that would look very similar to what we see with the nodules and liver health issues that we associate with high carbohydrates. So best information we have right now is it's still an issue with dealing with carbohydrates. They keep a lot of bacterial infections, especially Aeromonas. It seems like Aeromonas is running in the background all the time with these guys, and it's just waiting on a chance to break out and cause problems. So that's something that we don't have a good handle on. And when people try to raise them in tanks, this becomes even more of an issue. They're susceptible to fungus if you handle them in the winter, especially if you don't handle them correctly. Saprolegnia and some of the winter fungus can be a real problem with these guys. If you're looking to raise largemouth bass, first you got to know what's your target size, what's your target market. The sport fish stocking market is a big market. There's different sizes from 2 inches to 1/4 of a pound. There's demand for. There's also demand for bigger fish and even trophy size fish. And if you could figure out how to raise those guys, there's serious dollars there. We've done some work trying to get them past about 2 pounds, and they just stall badly. We have a hard time getting that any size beyond that, and you may have to do something like switching back to a forage fish or something to get those really large sizes. We can take them up to about 2 pounds readily on feed, and after that, we're getting usually into a third year of growth, and our growth really seems to slow down at that point. Again, what's your target market? These are just some examples of wholesale prices you can get for 2-inch fish and 6-inch fish, and then up to the bigger sizes of large stockers or even food fish or large size trophy fish. When we get into the food fish market, most of those are for over a pound and up to 2 pounds. I looked at some numbers even this morning. According to the latest aquaculture census, we're looking at probably about 3.8 million pounds of food size largemouth bass in the 2018 census. Most of these are going live into ethnic Asian markets, $350 to $550 a pound, actually up a little more than that, what they're showing in this census. And they retail them on their end as live fish, getting up to $15 a pound out of these live ethnic markets and on the retail end. USDA in their aquaculture census doesn't list largemouth bass under its food fish category. What you have to do is go into the sport fish pages, and there they list largemouth in a food size category or market size, but not as a food fish, but as a sport fish. Well, it's pretty reasonable to assume they're not stocking that many of these guys. So I think it's a pretty reasonable assumption that almost all of those are actually going to market as food fish. And it's just the census can't list them that way according to their regulations. So our latest census shows 71 farms raising about almost 3.8 million pounds of food size largemouth bass. Individual weight, average weight was about 1.4 pounds. And the average selling price is pretty good at $5.79 a pound average, according to the census. So that's almost $22 million worth of food size largemouth bass. And we talk about sport fish being a good stocker market, but food size is over 9 times the income generated by stocker size largemouth bass. We tend to think of this as a relatively new development. However, bass have been caught and sold commercially as a food fish all the way back into the 1800s. And although its native range is pretty much the Mississippi drainage, there was large scale stocking of these guys beginning in 1871, and by 1900, they've been stocked into all of the lower 48 states. So there's not a big issue, although it's not native to some of these drainages. Our government stocked them, and they're considered in stocking regulations as being regulated as native even in those other areas. In World War I, they pushed to make fish a bigger part. Largemouth bass was included in this booklet. What they were trying to do is conserve beef and grain to send to Europe to support them. So, since fish fed themselves, they pushed for more production, and they had largemouth bass right there on the cover of the book that they gave out. But that all ended with the Lacey Act and the Black Bass Act of 1926. So that basically ended largemouth bass as a commercial food fish by law. FDR's farm pond program, again, they were trying to get food production on the farms up And with that, they started to set up state and federal hatcheries to stock these thousands and thousands of ponds that were out there on the farms to make them a source of food. And that put some federal dollars and state dollars behind these hatcheries to figure out how to generate relatively small fingerlings to go out into the stocking programs there. So by the mid 60s, they were generating about 35 million largemouth bass fingerlings per year. And really the how-tos of that were very much the same as they had figured out in the 1880s. And really in many ways to raise small fish, processes and procedures really have not changed all that much since the 1800s and 1930s. It's still largely the same process to let them spawn, get the small fish, maybe move the broodfish or move the fry and into fertilized ponds for a natural feeding. It wasn't until this guy came on the scene. This is the man. This Jack Snow, who was at the Marion Fish Hatchery in Marion, Alabama, started looking at trying to train this fish to take feed. His objective was not to produce a food fish, but to get more fish out of the limited number of ponds that they had. So if you had fish just foraging on natural production of phytoplankton and zooplankton and the fertility base of the pond, you were very limited on the pounds per acre and number per acre. So his intention was to get these guys on feed so they could get more fish out of the limited ponds that they had for stocking programs. And then to grow some fingerlings to more advanced sizes to see if they could get the survival up in their stocking programs that they were working on. But Jack Snow is the guy that really did a whole series of papers, mostly in the 70s, to look at getting these guys on feed. So even as a commercial species, largemouth bass is listed in the classic, one of the very first aquaculture books published in 72 as showing potential among the centrarchids for an aquaculture species. And even in the 70s, it was already being produced in Europe. I get a lot of calls from Portugal, of all places, people interested in producing bass more intensively. And in the 70s, they were already raising them as a food fish in Taiwan. And you can buy largemouth bass online from Taiwan right now. So as we started to look at these, we'd done catfish work. Sean and I had worked on some walleye. First thing we did is just how does this fish grow at our temperatures in Kentucky? So this graph looked at just some relative growth that we'd done under similar conditions over the seasons, with the bass being the blue line and channel catfish being the red line, walleye the green line below. And you can see during certain periods, like the second spring, they actually grow better than the channel catfish, although once it warms up into the heat of summer, the bass slow down and the catfish pull out and pass. But you can see we were getting similar growth to catfish, not so much with walleye. So that helped us to focus our efforts more on the largemouth bass as we move forward. Back in the 80s, USDA's Joint Subcommittee on Aquaculture looked at bass as one of the potential species, and they really identified practical diets, and they were ahead of their time with that, saying that would be a big part of developing this species. It's over 50% of production cost. The fish is a strict predator, and that says a lot about what they need to eat and what they can use and not use. Pretty much new catfish feeds were going to be too low in protein, and developed later on a hybrid striped bass, probably too much in carbohydrates. So most of your public and private hatcheries were using trout feeds, about 40% protein and high fat levels. So the very first thing we did is make some practical commercial scale feeds, different protein levels, and feed them out in a pond situation. And yes, more is better when it came to protein, up to a level of about 47%, which is pretty high compared to most of the. I had a catfish background, so that seemed really high to me. So we followed that on out. Andy Goodwin in Arkansas had they had some bass that they were moving. He was more of a pathologist. He identified it as a liver problem. This is the early 2000s, and did some work that said he felt like it was a carbohydrate intolerance. Even fed some low carb diets, and they recovered. So that was identified 20 years ago as being a potential problem with this fish. So we set up a trial where we took them up as close as we could get under these conditions with some commercial scale feeds. The bar on the left is 25% carbohydrate. This graph shows survival. Nutritionally, it's hard to kill fish with bad feed. They cold-blooded, they don't normally, they just don't grow as fast, but you rarely see big differences in survival. So this is one we did with just 25% carbohydrate, which is not really, really high, 19% and 13%. So you can see between 25% carb and 19, we saw a significant difference in survival, with lower carb being better survival. The little problem we get into is to make feed float, we need about 20% carbohydrate to make that pellet puff and float. So that right there is right at the level where we see problems with the largemouth bass liver health. So we did some work again, making commercial scale feeds, looking at reducing that carbohydrate. And if we get it low enough, we're going to have a hard time making that feed float. So this one shows with some custom diets that we did. LC, you can see across the bottom being least cost. We did some least cost formulations. The feed on the left, the blue bar there is a commercial steelhead diet. Then we had a low cost, least cost floating diet that was the same size. We made a bigger pellet to see if we could get more feed in them with that large mouth. And then we had a least cost and a sinking pellet. And you can see in our little research ponds, the harvest weights were actually a little bit better than even the commercial steelhead diet, and certainly better than the least cost. So this kind of yellow green is the exact same formulation as this purple, with this one floating and this one in a sinking pellet. So in that case, the low carbohydrate and the sink, these guys really don't like to come to the top. They're gun shy of coming up, especially on a sunny day. So the sinking pellet look good, but it's hard to implement on a larger commercial scale farm. Sinking pellets are cheaper to make than floating pellets. Extruders are expensive to operate, expensive energy wise, expensive to buy. So when we looked at feed cost per unit gain, the sinking pellet also looked attractive from that point of view. Here's one where we looked at fish meal level. Again, these are commercial scale diets. We compared them with a commercial steelhead diet, and we took fish meal down as low as 8% in this one. And you can see that the bass did well. A lot of the commercial feeds have 30% or so fish meal, and it looks like we can reduce that fish meal level down without sacrificing significantly some of the growth that we're able to get out of this fish. So from that series of studies that we did at Kentucky State, I would say that if we had the dollars to take this up to, there's research and development to take it out to do some farm field trials, which we did some of, but that's expensive. I still think that we can reduce the fish meal level in these diets. I think we would do best to, again, try to get those carbohydrate levels down, but that affects the floatability of the pellet. We need to do some commercial scale work to see if we can feed a sinking pellet. Dr. Lovell at Auburn years ago did a mix where he used floating pellets as kind of an indicator of feeding activity and mixed in sinking pellets to reduce costs. So some approach like that. Overall, what we find is the largemouth bass is much more flexible in its nutritional requirements than we thought he was going to be as we started working with the fish. We thought it'd be more like a salmon, very high, strict quality demands, but the bass seems to be much more amenable to some of the alternative ingredients, including really not requiring fish oil. Vegetable oil seem to to work just about as well with this guy. Here's a feed trial we did in ponds over a 2-year period a couple of years ago, several years ago now, where we used several commercial diets. We used a trout feed. Protein lipid was 40 and 12. A steelhead diet, 45-16. A very high quality largemouth bass diet, 48 protein, 18 lipid, and then we formulated a KSU feed that was 44 protein, formulated to be 12% lipid, and came out at 16. So it really was more of a 44-16, and fed this out and grew these fish all the way out on these different diets. Basically good survival overall with all 4 of these diets. Harvest weights, trout did not do as well. We did better with all 3 of the other diets, the 2 commercial diets and our formulation that we made. And then liver size, again, you can see that we had less impact on the liver with the KSU formulation. And we had a lot of other health indicators to go in with this as well. So again, it shows that we can make some adjustments, compete with these current very high priced commercial feeds. And I think those feed costs can be reduced, which is a major contributor to profitability in these guys. When we were putting together the Largemouth Bass book, I with the help of Dr. Rossi, recruited a researcher from China to bring us into view with what's going on over there. I knew they had been raising bass and it was a substantial industry there. I didn't know how long and I didn't know how large till we got an inside view into China. They've been raising them, as I said, in Taiwan, which China considers to still be part of China, since the 70s. They moved into mainland China in the early 80s, and it's become a very important species in China since the 80s. In 2010, they released a selected genetic strain called the Yulu #1, produced in the Pearl River Fisheries Institute. That genetic strain has a better body shape. They have less deformities, faster growth, higher total yields, and they have a lot higher uniformity, which is, if you talk to a commercial producer, is important to the market. They don't want some fish that are outside of the range, low or high, really. They want a very consistent uniform size, and this fish tends to be more uniform in individual weights. So in the year that he had access to, production wise, China produced about 334 million pounds of largemouth bass that year. And if you look up our U.S. channel catfish production industry, it was almost exactly the same. So our largest finfish industry in aquaculture in the U.S., they produce as many largemouth that year as we did channel catfish. So it's a important species. They do grow out in both ponds and what they call cages. I would call a net pen, these very large cages in some of the rivers and large reservoirs over there. Their feed and nutrition, their nutrition research has really progressed very rapidly in recent years. Until 2016, they were actually still feeding frozen trash fish. They were chopping up fish and feeding them to especially the pond fed fish, or mixing it with some formulated diet and some trash fish. So they were feeding fish to fish. However, the government came in and pretty much told them to stop doing that, to switch to formulated diets. And they said that was based on potential disease issues of feeding frozen fish to these fish. And I can't imagine it was very good for the water quality either. But by federal regulation, they pretty much had to switch over to formulated feeds. And since then, you see a lot of largemouth bass nutrition papers coming out of in China in recent years. In their nursery production, which some of the speakers, Sean and others, will talk about in China, they have two major methods. They're doing it in ponds, where they feed them primarily on plankton, relatively small ponds, shallow ponds, with pretty good survival, but low expense. And they do some in concrete tanks, shallow concrete tanks. I never was able to figure out what a water earthworm was that they're feeding, even after I tried translating and working with my contact there. Better survival, but high production cost in these nursery tanks that they're doing in China. So the opportunities part, what do we need to develop this fish further? In my personal opinion, I think number one is genetics. We've already seen with unintentional selection, fish adapt to the farm environment quite a bit. Even when we first started working with them, it was fairly difficult to get these flies to feed train. Now they go on feed much easier, using almost straight to small pellets with these guys. You might enhance it with some fish oil or soften it up, but we've already seen changes in just domestication. Domestication itself is somewhat of a genetic selection practice, but in almost any species, whether it be catfish or poultry, one of the first things you do is try to improve the beast itself to adapt to our more intensive production methods. This could also influence their nutrition needs. They probably could breed a line that would tolerate carbohydrates better, commercial feeds better, certainly gets more disease resistance bred into these guys. So I think the number one need we have is some genetics in these guys to make a selected strain, and that's what China has done, and it's been very productive. And I think we need the same. However, genetics are facilities hogs and expensive. It takes a lot of different strains, a lot of different ponds, a lot of different tanks, and it's a multi-year process. So this is something that needs a concentrated effort and continuing support. Fingerling costs. If Carol Engel did the economics in the largemouth book that we did, about 30 to 45% of variable cost in most of her numbers were fingerling costs, and that's very high compared to other species. The other thing is these guys, it's hard to do controlled reproduction. Even if you give them hormones and things, Dr. Gomelski's worked on this, Dr. Simmons in our lab both worked on this. You just can't get them to free flow milk. So they have to kill the males, and that really impedes any genetics work you want to do. If you put several years into a selected fish and that male has to be killed to reproduce with the female, it really has a negative impact on any genetics work that you're trying to do. We need to get those feed costs down. According to Dr. Engel, feed costs are about 37 to 47%. That's not out of range too much with other species. We often say 40 to 50% of variable cost or feed cost. I think we can reduce the feed cost on these guys without sacrificing growth. We can get the fish meal down. We need to get carbohydrates down. I think we can reduce these feed costs really as much as 20%, maybe even 30% without sacrificing growth. We think about it, we look at it, do we move beyond the live market? There's some good things about the live market. We don't have to compete with China. They're not going to put, if you go into fillets, China can send in fillets, frozen fillets, and they're not yet able to send in live fish. So some of the good things about a live market, if it protects our domestic production. We don't allow long transport into these markets, but it's limited. There's how much can it grow? And actually the numbers I saw, it's grown more than I realized it. We've used 2 million pounds for several years, and it's closer to 8 according to our most recent census data. There are some solid frozen. You can buy largemouth bass on the internet from Taiwan, and they're frozen whole. But those are things. Do we move into a processing market? They fillet out well. They fillet out very similar to catfish, about 60% whole dress and about a 40% fillet. Positive market attributes, they're higher than salmon in the omega-3 fatty acids that salmon used as a selling point. Salmon have more fat, so you get a bigger dose of these fatty acids, but in bass, they're an actual greater concentration of omega-3 fatty acids than you'd see in salmon. To get up to large fillet sizes, you got to have a big fish, and that really, as we found, is hard to do with these fish. So we got to get them able to get past that bottleneck that we see at a couple of pounds. At a couple of pound fish, we could probably get a decent sized fillet, but we have to get those production costs down to make it cost competitive with anything else. And that hits the rewind back to genetics, and fingerlings and feed costs have to be reduced for this to become a potential. So these are some numbers I looked up just this morning as I compared. We've got 3 census that we could go back to. And if we look at millions of pounds production, the census showed 4 million pounds almost in 2005, about 2 million in 2013, which is the numbers we've been working with for a while. So we see it's showing the 2018 census showing about 3.8 million pounds of largemouth bass produced that year. That's the latest numbers we have. The average size, about 1.4 pounds. Average price was very good. In 2018, the average price was $5.80 a pound. And that price has gone up. Back here, you see the average size in 2005 was 2.5 pounds. Most of the fish back then were retired brood stock. They were producing for sport fish markets. And when those fish were retired, they weren't raising them for food fish. That was a way to get rid of retired brood fish. So they were bigger fish going to market. That size has gone down. as they've begun to be produced specifically for that market, and the price has gone up. They were only getting $2 a pound for those retired broodfish in 2005. We're getting almost $5.80 in 2018. So dollars generated, that has gone up. Even though the pounds weren't that different from 2005, the price is. So right at $22 million of food-sized largemouth bass in the census of 2018 census. So that's getting to be a substantial industry if we treat it as such. So on the opportunity side, if we really want to grow it, and bigger's not always better. Maybe we just stay under the radar and we keep producing what we're doing and be glad to get what we're getting with this species. If we wanted to grow it further, you got to get on the radar with funding agencies. You got to get on the radar with the political side of things. You have to show a critical mass. You have to show it as an industry. And, $22 million is getting there. One of the problems we have is somewhat working together. We're on that northern knob of the Southern Regional Aquaculture Center when we look at the USDA regional aquaculture centers. Most of the folks on this call are probably in the north central. Most of the markets are in the northeastern. So that makes it hard to sit down in the regional center technical committee or industry committee and make a case for the fish. I was on our technical committee on SRAC for years, and it's totally dominated by catfish. And the only interest I ever got in funding some bass research is when it looked like catfish might crash and they wanted to know what else they could move into. All of a sudden, bass was a big interest to them. So, but we have to, if we want to grow it, we have to organize it. And, there are organizations where if you look at largemouth bass compared to the census numbers, we're 2/3 of the size of the hybrid striped bass industry. We're 60% of the U.S. tilapia industry. We're larger than red drum, and we're 1,500% of yellow perch, which they have several organizations. So probably if you want to grow it, you have to get organized. You have to have a critical mass when it comes to USDA funds, to voters, to legislative attention. It's all about the number of people involved and the dollars. The dollars are getting there, but we would need to somewhat organize to try to get on the political radar screen if we wanted to get the research that's required to do long-term genetics or large-scale feed work and those kind of things. So that's my personal opinion. These organizations are usually best generated and organized and run by the commercial side, not some professor with a bunch of initials behind his name. That's not who these guys want to hear from. So that's what I've got with opportunities and issues kind of presentation. I don't think, are we going to hold questions to the end and do it in the roundtable type of situation?
I think we're going to do a little bit of both.
Okay.
So we have about 8 more minutes before the next presenter, so we can take some questions that are specific to your presentation now and then continue the discussion at the end.
How come I can't see me here? Come help.
My agenda showed 40 minutes and I'm right on 40 minutes. So we're somewhere different in the agenda.
Oh, well, because the introduction was shorter.
Okay.
So I'll go ahead and read off a few questions that we got in from the audience. So your first one is referring back to the nutrition work, and it's actually in 4 parts. So high carbohydrate percentages in largemouth bass diets are shown to cause liver damage, stress mortalities, increased glycogen in livers, and sensitivity to bacterial and viral infections. What percentage causes these issues? Why is this information not listed on the bag, that question was answered in the chat. Which manufacturers offer feeds with 12 to 15% carbohydrates? And can you describe the symptoms of largemouth bass being fed feeds with high carbohydrates?
Well, the closest thing to a magic number we have is about 20% carbohydrate level. When we get above that in that trial that we did, we only went, I think it was 23 or 25, and we saw a reduction in survival. The problem we get into is like I said, that it's 20% carbohydrates, two magic numbers. It's a magic number where bass start to have problems. It's also the magic number that's required to make a feed pellet float in an extruded feed. So you don't see obvious external. The fish get sick. They die primarily of other causes like bacterial infections. It's not a direct symptom that you can see. But when you go to diagnose why did this fish die, you open them up and the liver it looks almost like tumors. These nodules have a lot of glycogen deposits that displaces functional liver tissues, and the liver is the clearinghouse of all things as far as detoxifying a lot of different metabolic processes. So when the liver doesn't work, the fish is susceptible to all kinds of issues. They don't have to list carbohydrates because really all people ever cared about was protein and lipids and other of the macronutrients and things. So carbohydrates have always just been cheap energy. So they're not required on the tag labels to list carbohydrates. So somebody buying it can get that information from the feed companies, but you won't necessarily see it on the tags. You can calculate it with some of the ingredients, but they don't give you exact ingredients either. They change in the least cost fashion. What else did I miss in that 4-part? My brain will only hold 2 or 3. So
I think you did really good.
well.
The last one was about symptoms, but you tackled that, and you have to cut the fish open to look at the liver to see what that is.
Yeah.
The producer did send a follow-up question. So he asks, would that be caused if the carbohydrate is 20.8%?
You know, it's not that exact, and there's different forms of carbohydrate. You know, fiber and starch and all those things are kind of in the carbohydrate group over there. So 20.8, no, I couldn't tell you that would that's far too precise. I threw 20 out as a magic number, but it's not that magic that, you know, 8 percentage points is going to do it. But you get above that and we start to see a trend towards increasing issues.
So to verify, you'd have to cut that fish open and look at that liver.
Yep. Yeah. And even there can be other things. You have to get down under, you know, send it to a pathologist to do histopath to see if those liver nodules are something else other than like glycogen deposits. And so you can unzip him and open him up and see a pale liver with nodules and be pretty sure that's what it is. But to definitely confirm that, you've even got to get down on the microscopic level to see what's in there. Because there's parasites and things that can also get in the liver that look similar.
The next question is pretty specific. It refers back to the study you were talking about different pellet types, so sinking and floating. And the question was, what were your sample sizes for that study?
Sampling over time, you know, we would pull a seine and weigh and sample, you know, probably 30, 40, 50 fish in a 10th acre pond. So it's a pretty big percentage. It's probably 10% of the population. The final harvest numbers are based on 100%. Total harvest, total counts, total weights. So, you know, the final harvest numbers not a sample size. It's 100% of the fish.
Mike Pichetti.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I had a question on the Florida strain of largemouth bass versus whatever you guys are growing up there. 70 degrees is normal most of the year here. Does the Florida strain allow you to use operational procedures at warmer temperatures?
In general, the general rule has been the Florida strain is not as good a culture fish. So there's a temperature aspect, but there's also the northern strain is a better fish for fish culture.
When you're buying fingerlings, most of those come out of Arkansas. We don't even know what we're getting. So you don't know if it's more Florida, you don't know if it's northern strain, or you don't know if it's a mix. So they don't really put that on a tag when they sell it to you, so you don't really know what you're getting.
But it's probably mostly northern with a little bit of Florida mixed in.
Okay. Well, it seems like the thing is to go over to that Pearl River and get that strain. It seems like that's the only genetics that's being done over in China.
Yeah, guess where they got theirs? We send it to them, but they don't send it back. Very likely Auburn sent those over in the 70s.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot for your question, Mike. For sure, afterwards, make sure if you're not a presenter to meet yourself afterwards. Next off, someone asked in the chat, Rachel wants to know if any universities have tested any levels of carbs in the feed from any of the major suppliers that folks get their largemouth bass feed from.
There was that commercial feed comparison that I put up there. It had carb levels in that table. But what they make this week, what they make next week is most of that stuff is open formulation. It's a least cost type approach. They don't change them a lot, but it's a pretty easy analysis if somebody wanted to take it to their local land grant university or even run it through the extension and probably get a bit analyzed for that. But they don't have to list it, but you don't have to buy it. If you want that number, they have that number. And if you talk to your rep, they should give it to you. You can guarantee that they know the number. So if you don't have to buy it if you don't trust it. So tell them you want to know.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.